All right, here's the situation. I plan on releasing this right before servers come up on Tuesday. That way, players can kind of get an idea of which dungeons are easy and which dungeons are going to be hard. This video is going to be aimed at, like, we're looking to try to do a weekly key, or we're looking to try to farm some keys. What are going to be the easiest dungeons to do, particularly aimed at my thoughts on, like, how LFG or pugging should operate in this dungeon. Now, I did a lot of PTR keys. I pugged a lot of PTR keys as well. And there were specific trends for specific dungeons that I found made some of them much easier or much harder than others. And we can kind of go through and talk about what makes the dungeons easier and harder just in general. There's also some timer stuff that's related to the dungeons as well. I have the timers on screen right here. Most of them tend to be pretty short. This MOTHERLODE one is incorrect. This MOTHERLODE one got changed a couple of days ago as well. So that should be a little bit of a shorter dungeon as well. So I think it's like 35 minutes now or something like that. But we'll kind of talk through the timers. We'll talk through what makes these dungeons hard, which makes these dungeons easy. And the aim of this video is basically going to be like, what is the most pug-friendly dungeon this season? We'll start with the hardest ones. By far, the hardest dungeons to pug are going to be Priory of the Sacred Flame and Operation Floodgate. And we'll start talking with Priory of the Sacred Flame. First and foremost, the end of Priory is very, very difficult. You have to pull it like it's like a Cataclysm or Wrath of the Lich King dungeon, where you're basically pulling the trash back into a corridor. There's a lot of potentially very easy ways that you can actually wipe to a bunch of the casters. There's a ton of casters in that room. If the patrol accidentally ends up getting body pulled, you're probably wiping and depleting the key. In addition to that, the timer is not exactly free, but it's not super difficult. But there's a lot of trash that you can accidentally body pull. And I think that there's another thing that you need to know about the dungeon is that there are mobs and packs that you should pull, and there are mobs and packs that you shouldn't pull. Priory of Sacred Flame, especially if you watch the video that was released yesterday, requires you to pull very specific mini bosses that are in the dungeon as well. If you don't pull the correct mini bosses, or you don't pull enough mini bosses, this makes this dungeon a lot harder. It's also really easy to miscount if you're not super careful. In Priory of Sacred Flame, just a lot of the damage, a lot of the ambient damage, a lot of the group damage that happens in this dungeon is going to be a little bit harder for a healer. So early heal checks, especially whenever your group doesn't know what's going on, especially when nobody's pressing your defensives, that's going to make this dungeon super difficult for a pug situation. Operation Floodgate is a little bit different than that. Operation Floodgate I actually don't think is super bad to complete. I think that Operation Floodgate has a couple of key issues for pugs, though, especially early season pugs. There are pulls that you should do, and there are mobs and pulls that you realistically shouldn't do. Snipers with any other trash pack other than like snipers are very dangerous. Same with the Blood Warpers. The Blood Warpers, at least for high keys, are basically skipped as frequently as you reasonably can because they straight up just do a little bit too much damage to you. You do have to play the two that are required, but they're not that easy. And so coming up with like a route, especially in a very open dungeon like Operation Floodgate, is going to be pretty hard. And this kind of brings me to my second point. The heal checks in here are very difficult. There's bubbles, there's the second boss, there's the third boss. That all have pretty difficult heal checks on top of the fact that you need to know the route. You have to go to these specific caches. You have to make sure you're pulling the Blood Warpers. Whenever you pull the Blood Warpers, your healer has to know how dangerous they realistically are. And so you have to really watch out for some of these heal checks. And we're not doing the highest level of keys. You know, these are farm keys that we're doing LFG. But your healer has a lot of burden on them to actually be able to time this dungeon. The final thing for Floodgate, and this isn't necessarily true with Priory. Priory's timer is like okay, especially if you're pugging keys that you're geared for. But Operation Floodgate has a pretty difficult timer. I wouldn't be shocked if they end up increasing Operation Floodgate's timer, because right now I think it's sitting at 32 minutes. I wouldn't be shocked if it ends up going to 34, 35 minutes, essentially because the timer just feels a hair too tight. And so whenever it's these combination of things, you need to know the route, there's a bunch of heal checks, and the timer's a little bit tight. That just makes this kind of a nightmare situation for pugging. That's why Priory and Floodgate are in the tier that I would recommend. You know, maybe we look to find a different dungeon. If we have a different dungeon that's available to us, there's a lot of stuff that's a lot easier than Priory of Sacred Flame. Cinderbrew Meadery is a little bit easier than Priory and Operation Floodgate, but I actually don't think that Cinderbrew Meadery is that easy. There's a decent amount of tank damage that goes on in this dungeon. There's some mobs that enrage. There are some volley kicks that are required interrupts, although that's not a ton of them. The first area of this dungeon, I think, is also particularly hard. Understanding how to navigate Chef Chewy, understanding how to navigate the muscles, and getting through this first area is not the easiest thing. Again, we're not doing the highest level of keys or the most difficult level of content, but this is still a difficult section of the dungeon. And, you know, in pugs and in farm keys, even if you wipe, you know, you do have some room for recourse, especially since Challenger's Peril has been removed off these keys, but you don't have like multiple wipes in you. And I think that this dungeon has potential room for a lot of deaths, and it's just a little bit less, it's less complicated than Priory and Floodgate, but a little bit more complicated than some of the dungeons that we're going to talk about in the future. Motherlode, I would say, is next. Now, Motherlode, I think is... So it's in B tier because it's a returning dungeon, but a lot of the mobs are a little bit different in here. One of the biggest tips that you need to know about Motherlode is that you need a lot more count than you would expect in this dungeon. The first area is also a little bit cursed. You should look to go left after the first Peacekeeper instead of going to the right. That's one of the biggest tips that I can give for you, because the assassins are very deadly. They do a lot of damage with their cast, and so canceling that cast as quickly as possible is nice. Having double assassin is just a ton of damage on your, and so you have to watch out for that. Also, try to pull as few Peacekeepers as humanly possible, but you're gonna be a little bit stretched thin on count. So try to over pull in a couple of these sections, pull a little bit more count than you would necessarily think, and you should be more or less fine. But I think that Motherlode does have some similarly difficult parts. I think the last area of Motherlode is very, very dangerous. Some of the war machines, the mines, have a ton of health relative to what they do. In the past, you know, they would take a couple globals to kill off. Now on like a higher-ish level key, they have like 30, 40 million health. They take 20 seconds of probably like 10 seconds of like actively hitting them to be able to kill them off. And so the last area is a little bit obnoxious. I actually don't think the bosses are necessarily too bad, but there's actually a decent amount of changes that players won't necessarily expect, especially whenever you're looking at like a returning dungeon. The final boss of this dungeon I also find to be a bit more tricky than it was in the past. So Mogul Raznuk wasn't a fight that was necessarily too hard in the past, but now they've changed the Gatling gun cast to kill you basically if you're getting hit by it. It used to be able to pop a defensive and walk through it. Now this might be the case for a couple times during some of these farm level keys, which is why, again, this is not like the hardest level of dungeon. But it's still going to do a decent amount of damage to you, and the checkpoints in this dungeon aren't necessarily forgiving as well. And so that, coupled with the fact that it's not super easy. The timer's kind of lenient, but the timer's really lenient, which is another reason that it's in B. But you're not going to know exactly all the mechanics and stuff like that, and it can punish you. And so that's a lot of the reason that it ends up going into B. Rookery is probably also a B tier dungeon. I actually don't think that Rookery is all too hard, and I actually think that they've made some changes to make Rookery easier over the past couple of weeks. I think that one of the reasons that it's in a higher tier, a lot of the times, is because it's just like, new. It's not super lenient on the timer, although the timer's not necessarily that bad. But it's you're going to end up having to hold W through it, but you can still accidentally overpull and end up wiping. The second boss in this dungeon is also very dangerous, particularly for melee. There's a bunch of wipes that can be caused on the second boss. There's also a bunch of wipes that can be caused on the last boss. And if either of those things happen, you're probably going to end up depleting this key. But I don't think it's like overly punishing. There's not a bunch of tank damage. There's not a bunch of casters that are going on, but lack of experience, lack of knowledge about what the mobs are doing, and just unfamiliarity with the dungeon is going to end up putting this in a B tier with me. You could maybe argue that it's supposed to be an A. It's really not that bad, but I think that it's going to just be in B for now. Next up, we have 3 dungeons left with Darkflame Cleft, Mechagon Workshop, and Theater of Pain. And I think that Darkflame Cleft and Workshop are probably in my A tier. So Darkflame Cleft, I know that, people see Darkflame Cleft and they go, ew, bad dungeon. But realistically, if you can get through the first area of Darkflame Cleft, this dungeon's timer is very, very easy. I would recommend taking this dungeon incredibly slowly, and that's why I'm kind of putting it in A tier. You're not going to be doing a level of which the first area can punish you super hard. If you want to tip for the moles, they don't throw rocks on people that are in melee, so you should be looking to get a melee of these mobs. Just pull really, really slow in that first area, and if you are able to achieve that, then it's really difficult to wipe. The timer, very generous in here. If you can have some people that are able to perform some of the mechanics, it should be more or less one of the dungeons that's not... It's an easier dungeon to complete under the timer, because there's a lot of forgiveness in terms of that timer efficiency that's in Darkflame Cleft, and that's why I'm putting it in A tier. Again, it's really, really forgiving in terms of the timer, and that's a huge thing. Mechagon Workshop is going in my A tier because actually not a lot has changed with this dungeon. The Machinist Garden encounter and the final boss encounter are still just as hard as they have been in the past. You can still wipe to Kujo if somebody accidentally blows up your box. There's still potential fail cases in this dungeon. The last pack of the dungeon is also very challenging still. But realistically, this is the third time we've seen Mechagon Workshop, and it's mostly the exact same. Now, there are, some stuff that's a little bit different here with how some of the mobs function. There's maybe some little bit changes in the packs. But realistically, not enough has changed to make this a difficult dungeon. And this is a great dungeon to farm if you're looking to just kind of do weekly keys. That leaves my final dungeon for farming dungeons, the Theater of Pain in S tier. Again, another returning dungeon, so people should at least have some familiarity with the dungeon. If you never played Shadowlands, I'm sorry, but some people in your group are probably going to have played Shadowlands and actually have done this dungeon in some capacity. It plays very similarly to how it did in Shadowlands. Not much is different. They actually didn't change up the mobs too much. If you want, you could play a very similar route to what you did back in Shadowlands. The only difference basically between now and then is Kultha Rock is a very different encounter, but Kultha Rock's not an encounter that's unintuitive, I would say. It's basically you just dodge these orbs, you drop the arrows that are above your head on top of other players away from the boss, you kill the ads that are trying to walk to the boss before they contact them, and you make sure that you spread whenever you get the Shadow Well. That's basically it beyond the base mechanics of the dungeon that were present back in Shadowlands. And so with that being the case, that's what's putting my Theater of Pain for me in S tier. In addition to that, Theater of Pain is probably one of, if not the most lenient timer currently on the PTR. This is great news for players who, again, are going to have mistakes. I think that, week one dungeons, players are going to have mistakes. It's going to be difficult to pug, particularly for pugging in LFG and stuff like that. There's going to be a lot more mistakes just happening in general. And I think that lends Theater of Pain's timer to be great. And those are the dungeons and how I kind of feel about where you should be looking to pug, where you should be looking to go, kind of what you should be looking out for in some of these dungeons. I hope it helps you guys a lot. Again, just kind of be looking to avoid Priory, Operation Floodgate, and Cinnabar Meadery until you get some more reps in those dungeons. If you're playing with your friends, doesn't really matter anyways. And I will see you guys in tomorrow's video. Goodbye. And if you enjoy Mythic Plus content, like and subscribe. I appreciate it. But goodbye.